My name is Margaret Sullivan. I am 64 years old. And for most of my life, I believed being a mother meant holding the family together no matter what it cost me. Tonight, at my son's wedding rehearsal, I learned what it really means to draw a line. When I stood to offer to walk Mason down the aisle, he looked me in the eye and said his fiancée's mother would take my place. "You're not even half the woman she is," he added. The room went still. My hands didn't shake. I rose calmly from the back row, smoothed my jacket, and spoke with a voice that carried through the chandeliered hall. "Perfect. Then she can take over your debt payments too. The $1.2 million you've buried under my name." Every face turned white. Mason's jaw tightened. Vivienne Pierce blinked, stunned by the words she never expected me to say. And Charlotte, the bride, looked between us as if the ground beneath her dress had opened. That was the moment the story shifted. I was no longer the grateful mother in the shadows. I was the only one willing to drag the truth into the light. The rehearsal was just the beginning. The real clock was already ticking. And I knew exactly how little time we had before the whole performance collapsed. The ceremony was set for noon tomorrow, but the real showdown was scheduled for 10:30 in the morning. That was when Graham Pierce, Charlotte's father, had agreed to let me confront Mason in the hotel manager's office. By then, the wedding machine would already be in motion, guests seated, photographers waiting, bills pending. The Astoria Harbor Hotel had a final charge ready to post to Mason's account at dawn, $47,000 for the reception. If that charge bounced, as I knew it would, the hotel would demand immediate payment in front of everyone. That single moment could blow the facade apart. But I wasn't about to wait for a credit card decline to expose the truth. The Pierces believed they had vetted Mason thoroughly. Their attorneys had checked assets, investments, even club memberships. What they missed were the so-called co-signer arrangements buried in his paperwork, the pieces that tied back to me. When I saw my name attached to debts I had never agreed to, I understood the danger. Tomorrow's ceremony was set like a loaded stage. By 10:30, Mason would either confess to Charlotte, or I would make sure 300 guests heard the truth from me. When I began tracing the trail of Mason's spending, 3 numbers stood out like red flags waving in the wind. The first was $2,000. Mason told me it was for a critical business dinner with potential clients. In reality, the receipt showed a private table at a luxury steakhouse and designer rentals charged on the same night. It was less about networking and more about dressing the part for Charlotte's world. The second was $3,500, supposedly for new office equipment. The paperwork listed a copier lease, but the delivery address wasn't an office suite. It was Mason's own apartment, a glossy machine that sat unused in his living room, serving only as a prop to back up his lies about running a company. The third was the most glaring $45,000 for an engagement ring from Tiffany. He told Charlotte it was a symbol of commitment. What it really symbolized was reckless debt. The purchase was made with credit tied to a loan that carried my home address as collateral. My name, without my consent, had been pulled into his illusion of wealth. Those 3 moments, 2,000, 3,500, and 45,000 were enough to strip the disguise bare. Mason's empire was nothing more than forged signatures and stolen trust. At 10:30 sharp, the hotel manager's office door closed behind us, sealing the room in a silence heavier than the velvet drapes. Mason stood before me in his tuxedo, polished shoes, and the kind of confidence only a liar can wear. I laid the folder on the desk, every page organized, every receipt highlighted. His smile faltered when he saw his own signature repeated beside mine. Signatures I had never written. I spoke evenly, the same tone I once used as an auditor when catching vendors in their games. The company registered at my address, the payroll from your advertising job, the credit lines tethered to my property. Every number here belongs to you. Mason, Every lie now sits in black and white. He tried to stall, to claim he was protecting me, to say it was temporary, until the wedding secured his future. Then his eyes hardened, and he muttered the threat I already expected. If you expose me, I'll tell them you're confused. Just like Grandma was at the end. That was the last string he could pull, and it snapped in his hands. I leaned forward so he couldn't mistake me. You have 15 minutes. Either you tell Charlotte everything about the debts, the forged documents, and the fantasy company, or I will stand in front of 300 guests and tell them myself. His face drained of color. Tuxedo or not. And when he finally turned toward the elevator, I knew he was walking into a storm of his own, making. I didn't have to wait long. 10 minutes after Mason stepped into the elevator, the sound of screaming broke through the gilded quiet of the Astoria Harbor's upper floors. Charlotte's voice carried down 3 levels, sharp with betrayal, echoing off marble and polished brass. Hotel staff rushed to seal the hallway, ushering guests away from the bridal suite. But nothing could muffle the rage of a woman discovering her future had been built on counterfeit promises. I stayed in the lobby, pretending to read a magazine. When Graham Pierce approached, his expression was carved from stone, but his eyes held something closer to grim respect. He didn't waste time. Margaret, he said, you gave him the chance. Now I need the final proof. I slid the folder into his hand, 3 anchors of evidence, the 2,000 dinner, the 3,500 copier, the 45,000 ring. Graham studied the pages in silence, the weight of old money and hard reputation pressing down. For a man used to control, this was the pivot. He would protect Charlotte. But he would also make sure Mason's lies didn't stain the Pierce name. The decision was no longer mine alone. The storm had moved to their side of the aisle. The ballroom had been arranged like a theater, with 300 guests waiting for the curtain to rise. Chandeliers blazed overhead. Violins whispered in the corner, and servers carried trays of champagne. But the illusion cracked when the hotel manager stepped onto the stage with a clipboard in hand. He cleared his throat and announced that the final balance of $47,000 for the reception had been presented to the groom's account. The payment was declined. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Vivienne Pierce's glass trembled in her hand. Guests leaned toward each other, whispers rolling through the room like a tide. Mason stood frozen, his tuxedo perfect, but his face drained of color. He reached for excuses. But Charlotte arrived before he could open his mouth. Her bridal gown trailed behind her as she walked down the aisle alone. Eyes red but steady. She didn't wait for explanations. She raised her voice so that every senator, judge, and banker in the room could hear. The wedding is off. The orchestra faltered. Champagne flutes rattled. And 300 people saw the mask fall. I stood in the back, my voice calm but cutting. Whoever wants to lead him down the aisle, I'll be ready to take his debts too. Once the ballroom dissolved into chaos, the lawyers moved with precision. Graham Pierce's lead counsel took the folder I had given him and began drafting a formal submission. Within an hour, copies of the forged loan documents, the shell company registration, and the co-signer agreements bearing my name were in the hands of federal investigators. What had been whispered, suspicions became evidence of fraud, identity theft, and deliberate deception. For my part, I signed the victim affidavit without hesitation. It was the only way to protect myself from being bound to Mason's debts. Every fraudulent line that carried my name was now officially documented as stolen. And the record would make it clear that I was not a partner in his crimes but the target of them. Graham stood over the process like a watchman, ensuring Charlotte's dignity remained untouched while the truth was laid bare. By evening, the State Financial Crimes Unit had been notified, and Mason's fantasy unraveled into criminal procedure. He called me once, asking if I would shield him. I told him plainly that I wasn't testifying against him, I was testifying for myself. The difference mattered, but not enough to save him. The law had already taken its course. Mason finally stopped running, cornered by evidence, abandoned by Charlotte, and stripped of the Pierce family's protection. He sat across from me with tears cutting through the veneer of arrogance. He admitted what I already knew: the debts were real. The signatures were forged. And the company he paraded was nothing more than smoke. His voice cracked as he pleaded for understanding. He told me he did it out of love, that he only wanted to give Charlotte the life she deserved, that once the wedding was sealed, he would have confessed and worked to fix everything. But excuses dressed as love don't wash away theft. I told him what needed to be said. Words he could no longer twist. Love does not raid a mother's retirement. Love does not pawn her house as collateral. Love does not gamble with another woman's trust just to climb into a world built on lies. He stared at me like a child caught in a storm, searching for shelter that no longer existed. He whispered that the wealthy never press charges, that Graham would quietly settle, that this would all fade. I shook my head. The law was already moving, and his delusions had no place left to hide. By the end of the weekend, the fallout spread like dominoes, tipping one after another. Mason was served with a formal summons from the State Financial Crimes Unit. His accounts were frozen, his credit lines revoked, and every piece of luxury he had borrowed or leased was repossessed. The sports car disappeared from the valet line. The tailored tuxedos were returned. And even the engagement ring was seized as evidence. What had looked like a life of status dissolved into inventory for the courts. Charlotte withdrew from the spotlight with quiet dignity. She stepped away from the wedding chaos, resumed her work at the law firm, and allowed her father's attorneys to handle the wreckage. A few weeks later, a note reached me through Graham's office. She thanked me, not for breaking the wedding, but for refusing to let her walk blind into a trap. It was brief, but the kind of note that carries more weight than paragraphs. For me, the outcome was both sobering and liberating. The victim documentation cleared my name from every forged loan. Insurance covered part of the financial damage, and I secured my accounts against future misuse. What Mason had stolen in trust, I rebuilt in boundaries. Investigators soon discovered Mason was not operating alone. The documents tied him to a wider fraud ring, targeting families like mine. His story was no longer a private shame, it became part of a larger case. And as much as it hurt, I felt a strange relief. Justice wasn't just chasing him. It was catching the whole scheme. The call came on a quiet afternoon while I was sorting through bills at my kitchen table. A detective from the state police introduced himself and explained that the investigation had widened far beyond Mason. Dozens of families had been pulled into the same web of fraud. My case, he said, was one of the clearest examples of how easily elder financial abuse could hide under the mask of family loyalty. Then came the invitation. Would I be willing to testify at a congressional hearing? For a moment, I sat in silence, staring at the phone as if the weight of the request could tip the table. Speaking publicly about my son's crimes would mean reliving every humiliation, every forged document, every disparity lie. But it would also mean protecting other mothers who might be writing checks in good faith while their futures drained away. I agreed. Not because I wanted revenge anymore, but because I had survived it. I knew the red flags, the subtle tricks, the paperwork that should never be ignored. If my voice could turn one story of betrayal into a safeguard for others, then it was worth it. I wasn't just a victim. I was proof that the silence can end. Mason's downfall came swiftly. Within weeks, federal charges were filed for fraud, identity theft, and forgery. He accepted a plea deal that carried years in prison and restitution he could never fully repay. The courts stripped away the illusion he had built, leaving nothing but a public record of deception. His name once whispered in country clubs and ballrooms, became a cautionary headline. There was no rescue waiting, no hidden fortune, no forgiveness that could erase what he had done. Vivienne Pierce disappeared from the social committees she once ruled. The spectacle of her trying to replace a mother at her own son's wedding had left a stain too deep for polite society to ignore. Invitation dried up. Whispers followed her into every room, and she quietly withdrew to protect what little pride remained. Graham Pierce acted with ruthless efficiency. He tightened every background check in his empire, funded legal efforts to protect vulnerable families, and made certain that Charlotte's reputation remained intact. His wealth and influence, once nearly compromised, turned into a shield for his daughter. Charlotte found her strength in resilience. She returned to her practice, determined not to let betrayal define her. Months later, word reached me that she had found companionship again, this time with someone honest, steady, and unremarkably real. As for me, I closed the file with my name cleared. I moved into a modest coastal apartment, free from forged debts and free from silence. My work now was to help others recognize the signs I had missed. Mason's story ended in prison, but mine continued with boundaries stronger than steel and the knowledge that justice, though costly, had finally been served. Thank you for staying until the end of Margaret's story. If this journey struck a chord, share the one red flag you would never ignore in your own life. Your voice may be the warning someone else needs. Subscribe for more true-to-life revenge stories where justice is never left unfinished.